Welcome to Writing the Wrong Way, where we talk about how writing works, how writers work, and how the best writers risk being strange. But today, I'm talking to Ryan Fitzpatrick, not so much about his writing, although a little bit about his writing and a little bit about my writing, but mainly about prose poetry. We were kind of asked to talk about prose poetry by Rob McLennan for a project he's doing. And I thought, why not kill two birds with one stone and kind of talk about it on the podcast, and get it nicely transcribed out and everything for Rob, and see how and just have it a bit more of a flowing conversation than the kind of more academic thing that we're maybe used to doing when we talk about this stuff. But specifically what we want to talk about is prose poetry. So Ryan, can you maybe just kick it off a little bit by talking, just maybe explaining to people who aren't familiar what prose poetry really is?
What it really is?
Yeah, what it truly is.
Finally exposing the secrets of prose poetry.
Prose versus verse.
So to prepare for this, I came up with all these questions. So I imagine we'll dig into this a bit. But to give you kind of a pocket definition of what prose poetry is, maybe to the uninformed listener, maybe when they think about poetry, they think about maybe they go back to the 16th century or something, and think about sonnets or think about metrical lines. Maybe they flash forward to the 19th century and start thinking about free verse. But I think most people, when they think about poetry, they think about, it's got lines and it's got stanzas. Maybe it rhymes, maybe it has meter, maybe it doesn't. But lines and stanzas are pretty central, I think, to the popular understanding of poetry. Prose poetry kind of scrambles that a bit by changing what I would call the basic unit of composition. So rather than focusing on lines and stanzas, prose poetry uses the sentence and the paragraph as kind of units of thinking. Which that's a fair definition, right?
I think
that's literally all it is.
And I mean, I would go a little at this point, now that anybody who never heard of prose poetry kind of knows what it is. At this point, maybe we'll slide into a bit more of the academia, highfalutin discussion of it. But the way I like to think, I like to just, when I think about it, I just always think about it kind of on the craft level, because I feel that's the least changeable level. We're real, Future, the rapper, is still using anaphora, just like Mesopotamian poets were using anaphora. They got very different purposes. They're very different political spheres that they're operating in, but it's the same technique, right? And so I usually try to just focus on the technique as a starting point for everything.
Yeah. Before
we get into the more socio-political sphere of it all. So the way I like to kind of just think about poetry as a baseline, I just sort of distinguish it a little bit I distinguish literary writing from non-literary writing in just a real simple, pragmatic way. The same way Shklovsky distinguishes it. It's got a defamiliarization effect is in play.
Yeah.
So when we're looking at something in literary language, there's just even bare minimum of that is you grab found text, pull it from one context to the other, you get a defamiliarization effect. Now we're in the literary world of language. And so I just think once we've had that happen, I just sort of separate poetry off as a sort of a type of literary language that is just more overtly interested in defamiliarization and is displaying more commonly its defamiliarization effects. Because in a lot of the times in fiction or prose, not always, but often, that the techniques that the writer is using are masking defamiliarization effects. They don't want you to kick out of the plot and notice how the novel is being written. Now that changes, of course, some writers will draw more attention to their style. But I think they don't want you to be too defamiliarized. They don't want you to be so defamiliarized that you throw their book in the trash. Generally speaking, right? And then poets, I think, tend to go the other way. broadly speaking. You've got some poets who are trying to approximate a breath line or something, or approximate the way people talk in more like a straightforward language way.
Yeah.
And they're not as interested. They're trying to like hide the artifice, but for the most part, poets are displaying their artifice, I think,
Yeah.
in a real brazen manner. You get like, and a lot of poetry is really self-involved with that idea all the way. I think the most obvious example to me always is, Shakespeare's Sonnet 130, where he's just talking about how other poets are bad compared to him, right? Like, and he's sort of praising his mistress on the one level, but really he's making fun of other writers for not being, as adept. He can insult his mistress and still praise her better than when they try to praise their mistresses, And I feel like prose poetry on a simpler level and a more obvious level is approximating, it's approximating that prose form, as you say, but I think it still has all the same goals of verse in terms of the defamiliarization effect. Like, it just seems to be more extreme. And I would even say a lot of experimental novels I would class under prose poetry. So that way I would say for me, it's like, it's not really a clearly defined thing, right? It's just sort of poetry that is sort of utilizing prose form, as you say. But I think often it has this effect or this goal of defamiliarization, and displaying defamiliarization in a manner of speaking. Yeah. And so it doesn't have, it's unmoored from narrative often too, for that reason.
Well, we can talk about narrative, because I think narrative is one of the components that can come back in. But here's a question. So, like, what do you see as being the benefits of turning to the sentence rather than using the line? Because I know one of the kind of like things that people get critiqued for sometimes, I think this is a silly critique, but I'll repeat it anyway, is that sometimes poems are just prose with line breaks, like just prose that's been broken up somehow. And so, like, the question sometimes is, why not just like write this as a prose paragraph? So in poetry, what do you think the advantage of using like a sentence rather than the line break would be?
I've thought about that a fair amount, because I've done mostly prose poetry. If you look at my published work, like in poetry, it's primarily prose poetry, or at least the best of it is prose poetry, and the stuff that's certainly gotten the most attention is prose poetry. And I've often wondered what draws me to it, because personally, when I'm reading a book of poetry, you turn the page and you see a prose poem, you're like, crap. Like, I don't even like to read prose poetry, broadly speaking. There's people I really love, which we'll get into, but broadly speaking, I don't like to read it that much, because it usually isn't doing the thing that I like about it as a writer. And I've tried to even just kind of get more of a handle on that and think about it. And I think what it really comes, in many ways for me, what I like about prose poetry is I kind of get to have it both ways, in the sense of, one thing I don't like about poetry is the speaker. And it's not a problem with poetry. It's just a problem that I think is with the cultural way that we perceive poetry, which is that you always have the reader conflating the speaker with the poet.
Yeah.
And it doesn't matter what you're writing a poem about. You could be writing a poem about how your eyeballs were eaten by spiders. They'll still think it's somehow about how you're feeling that day, and you can even write the line like, this isn't a metaphor, and they won't put you in, they won't read it like a narrative voice and like a narrator. They'll read it like the speaker is hiding something or coding something. And I think that's useful sometimes, but I find it's a real problem for me in poetry, because I don't have the interest. Broadly speaking, there's exceptions to this rule for me, but like, I don't have a whole lot of interest in expressing my particular emotions or opinions in direct fashion in poetry. I like to code or hide things, but I always, or draw attention to it in a really specific way. But what I really like is narrative voice. Like the more I think about my own writing, the more I like strange narrative voice. And so what I don't like about poetry is you get the audience just pulls you away from narrative, reading it like narrative voice. They don't just, it's just not coded that way. And it's hard. You have to work to code it that way. Whereas in a novel, it's all immediately coded as narrative voice, but you almost get a different problem, which is they want to tie you too closely to the narrative now. And so what I like about prose poetry is it kind of lets me have a narrative voice, but I don't really have to have a narrative.
Okay, but it's kind of tied to the way people perceive like lined poetry versus prose, and it gives this that kind of, you writing prose poetry gives you this kind of psychical in between space.
Yeah, it's a weird liminal position. The audience it kind of puts the audience in a strange liminal space in terms of the receptivity of it. And so I like those in between places. And if you know my work, of course you do, but like if somebody listening or reading this knows my work, they'll know I like to take like a film, like write an essay, poem. I like to write like a prose poem essay about a film. You know, like I like to really play in those weird. And then there's also that's couched inside of a sequence that is itself a narrative. You know, I like to really play in those weird liminal spaces like that.
That's really interesting, because it's really different than the value that I would assign to prose poetry, which for me the value of prose poetry has to do with like measure and poetic measure and the things that the sentence can allow you to do that the line can't. And like my poetry, if you were to go and pick up my books, you'd go, what is Ryan talking about? Like, he's never written in prose poetry. Which is like not true, because like I'm just not publishing in prose poetry. But like for me, like this moving to the sentence. So if you imagine like I was thinking about this, like if you were to extend the line out, eventually it just wraps around the edge of the page, right? And then you have to deal with prose. So at a certain point, like I like short lines. Short lines make sense to me as a form of measure, whether it's like a phrasal unit or a breath line or something else, something arbitrary. But as soon as you kind of drop that form of measure, you have to deal with the insides of the sentence, with the punctuation, with what ends up being, I think, a variable line length, where you can have like you don't have to worry about like consistency of line length. Suddenly you can have a sentence that runs like 100 words followed by a sentence that runs 3 words. So it's up to you as a poet to make sure that kind of like makes sense together, but it kind of frees up measure in a way, or it gives you a different way to measure what we could call the line, or what the rhythm or the flow of the writing. So for me, it has nothing to do with the perception between poetry, like lined poetry and prose. It has this different set of possibilities open up as soon as you switch from one to the other. And different poets take up that challenge differently. Like some will focus on the phrase and just kind of chain phrases with commas between them. Some will write like huge run-on sentences that don't end. Some will be really proper and like as if they were writing like an essay or a piece of flash fiction. I think that like there's a lot of options available within the prose poem that are not lesser than lined poetry, but they're different.
I think that's an interesting point, and it's interesting that you frame it that way, because although I hadn't really thought about it before, that is in many ways one of my other attractions to prose poetry. I kind of think about it. I've thought about it differently, but it amounts to the same as what you're saying. But what I always think about is like, I feel like there's more pacing possibilities in the prose poem, because as you say, when you're playing with the grammar of the sentence versus like how the lines stack up in stanzas or against one another and so on. Like I really like when I write line poetry, I like to have uniform line lengths or uniform stanzas.
Me too.
Yeah. And I don't always have a real meter necessarily, but I often will do. But like I like to be really uniform with it. I generally speaking, at least in the stuff that I feel is my best work, and that I have collected into books and stuff.
Yeah.
But when I move into post poetry, I feel like I know it's not really accurate, but I feel like there's more of that pacing possibility. And to kind of move, I'm always thinking of it from the point of view of how do I move the reader through the book or through the poem or through the sentence or through the paragraph or through the line, or through the stanza. Like I'm always thinking about it from that point of view. Like I'm trying to kind of anticipate and manufacture certain levels of reaction, or at least have a particular space for a certain set of reactions. So like to me, like that kind of effect of being able to move in and out of certain pacings and meters and measures is really important to me. And as you say, you've said it kind of differently, and I think in a bit more of a sensible manner. Like I'm kind of running on instinct maybe more with it.
Well, utilitarian maybe. I don't know.
But I like what you're saying, like, and it is very much how I think kind of unconsciously have been thinking about it. And when I pick one over the other, it sometimes will be for that effect. Because I'll even sometimes, like I remember in my poem sequence Psycho in Politics of Knives, which is all about the Hitchcock movie Psycho. It does kind of all those tricks you're talking about. In one sort of poem, and in one of the poems, I even actually, I actually, if you put line breaks in it, and just kept hitting enter, it actually is a perfectly, properly metered poem with end rhymes.
Yeah,
but I've just put it into prose, and I wouldn't normally do that, but I did in that one particular instance because it kind of weirdly, by having a lined poem shaped like prose, it just kind of jolted everybody. It kind of jolts the reader. In the poem, it happens right after the shower murder. It recounts like what is happening next, And so, again, it's all for really particular effects. And I just feel like I have that play. So I can even like literally have like metered lined poetry inside of prose. Because you don't expect it now.
Yeah. I don't have it handy, but like otherwise I would read a bit of it. But that reminds me of I don't know if you read Larissa Lai's most recent book of poetry. What is it like? I'm screwing up the title, so now I'm feeling really self-conscious. Like Iron Goddess, like it's a longer title.
Now I'm wondering if I have read one of her recent books.
But one of the things that struck me about that book, like once I realized I had to start reading it aloud, because it was doing what you're identifying is like in the middle of these prose bricks, there would be like a section that was really kind of metered and rhymed out, like almost like a spoken word piece, like within like this other form, like and it was really interesting that once I started reading it aloud, I could hear like the poem inside the poem, but like the prose was not obscuring it, but like allowing it to abut like other things at the same time.
You're talking about Iron Goddess of Mercy. I haven't read that book. I haven't read it, but I'm going to have to pick it up now that I know it exists. I somehow missed that one. But yeah, Iron Goddess of Mercy by Larissa Lai, Lai. Just to kind of circle a little bit backwards. One of the poems that I always think about is this book by Jenny Booley, which actually it purports to be a book of essays. Like it says in it, like it's called The Book of Beginnings and Endings, and it's subtitled Essays. But what it really is a kind of conceptual prose poem where what Booley has done is every 2 pages is sort of a different beginning page and ending page of an imaginary novel or essay collection that you aren't reading. So page 3 is like the first page of some imaginary book. Page 4 is the last page of some imaginary book, and so on and so forth. And they're all different fonts. They're all about different topics. They all kind of are these little fragments of beginnings and endings, right? Of these, again, kind of novels or essays or just other books. And I feel like that is the kind of thing that you can really do in prose poetry that you can't precisely do in other types of poetry, especially, or even like in a novel form.
Yeah.
So she's got like that, again, that she can really work with a fragment, like you can have like a fragment of narrative, you can have a fragment of an essay, you can have a fragment of a poetry poem, and it can have a conceptual structuring. You can have a book that has a structure and almost even has, in some ways, the pace of a novel or the pace and build of a collection or something, but yet actually doesn't have any of those things. Like you can approximate things. Like I'm really interested in reading and writing things that approximate other things, but aren't precisely them for whatever reason.
Okay.
So I like the idea that you can play, like I say, you can play around with narrative, you can play around with the essay, you can play with these different forms, but not really be doing them. You can kind of play around with, like it has the freedom of poetry, but you can play inside of the really structured architecture of prose.
Well, it reminds me, I don't think it's exactly like the Bully, but like the way you're talking reminds me of that Cassandra Blanchard book, Fresh Pack of Smokes. And I know you quite like, which like almost reads like a series of flash fictions, but because it's like, it's filed under poetry, it can play fast and loose with its narrative structures. And so it's fragmentary, maybe not on the level of the sentence, but the paragraphs like don't flow in any kind of like necessary order. They're all connected, but
partakes of the memoir genre.
But putting it under poetry instead of memoir loosens it up a bit.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's a great way to put it. It kind of lets her play with the that genre and the form of the memoir. Yeah, but not really be locked into it. And not even necessarily having to structure it chronologically, not having to even fully identify with it. If the poet or doesn't want to,
Well, I think we could say the same thing about like projects like poetic research is like a kind of growing buzzword, right? And I think prose poetry is one of the forms that works really well for poetic research. And I kind of set aside as like examples of this, like two books that are like very, very different, but are both kind of like prose poetry invested in research. And one is Claudia Rankine's Citizen, which are these kind of like there are longer essays in the book, but a lot of it is taken up with these like smaller kind of like paragraph long essays about microaggression. And so like Rankine is able to use the prose poem as a venue to, rather than making a really clear linear argument, to kind of accrete these little moments and let the argument happen over the accretion of these prose poems. The other one is Jordan Abel's Uninhabited, which is also a research piece, but it's invested in accreting data and asking the reader to kind of sort it out. So what Uninhabited does is it looks at a kind of massive number of public domain Western novels, and each poem is the result of a keyword search. So I feel like I need to grab the book so I can like look at give you some examples. So he would look for words that are tied to settler colonialism in a certain way. So territory or extracted or hold on, flipping through the book. Uninhabited. And he would do a keyword search through all these novels, and he would just pull the sentences and like accrete them into a massive prose poem, and then like ask the reader to sort through them as if they were just sorting through like a stack of like data to draw some conclusions from them. So I think like in those two ways, like the prose poem becomes like an interesting venue for poetic research, where there doesn't have to be like a strict conclusion to it, and it's looser in maybe the same way we're talking about Blanchard's book or Booley's book in terms of like getting rid of the middles of these like pieces. But it can carry some of the weight of prose, but like loosen it up, or fragment it is the word I think you used.
Well, in the some of the cases you're talking about too, they're literally working with fragments, and it's not that poetry can't, like line poetry can't work with fragments. In fact, it often does, right? Often the line in itself is its own little fragment in certain type of poetry. But I think that you've hit on something, maybe without really realizing it, that kind of harkens back to the earlier discussion a bit, which is that you have this audience anticipation in a lined poem that you're going to provide a conclusion.
Yeah.
And I think that whereas the prose poem so often ends mid-sentence, and there's this way in which it, I think, has a different sort of receptivity. Grammatically, you could, if there's just a different effect to ending mid-sentence or having a stream of fragments that don't really have a grammar, but are almost placeholding, where grammar might be. I just feel like that accretion effect is one, you can just physically see it in a prose poem more.
Yeah.
So like I did a poem in Politics and Knives again. I concluded that book with a really long, blocky prose poem called That Most Terrible of Dogs, where I was doing a lot of that kind of accretion of certain types of language I'd gotten from spam searches and things like this. And I started, kind of treating it and doing different things. But then I just started compiling it as this weird blocky, like tower. Yeah. It was inspired by, formally speaking, it was kind of inspired by Robert Fitterman's This Window Makes Me Feel book, which is one of my favorite books of prose poetry.
It's a collection of sentences. Isn't it a collection of sentences? Like it's a response to like 9/11. It's a 9/11 poem.
Yeah,
right?
It's basically a 9/11 book. But like structurally speaking, of course, for people who haven't seen that book, I think you can get it free online. I don't know if it's really available otherwise, but every sentence is just this window makes me feel. What he's more or less done is he's Google searched, for the word like this, something makes me feel. So he's searched like makes me feel. He's taken that phrase and he's added this window in front of it. And what you get, weirdly is this, none of it's all kind of talking around the kind of sentiment and, sadness and melancholy that, in a way it kind of attaches itself to that event. But what I really liked about, like, it's also just physically structured like a big block, a chain of text. And so I really like that. There's a way in which you can just, when you pile it up, it just looks like a wall when it's in prose, like that, if you have like no indentation and just go to the end of the line, it's like a wall of text. And page after page, you can have a wall of text. And there's a real emotional effect, I think, to sort of seeing that. And you don't get a break in a certain way. Like it kind of becomes exhausting.
Yeah. Well, the book that I thought about when that I'm thinking about in regards to that I had thought about when you first asked me to do prose poetry was Steve McCaffrey's The Black Death, which is a book that, like, I think, like, if you're a serious poet, you should read. But at the same time, I have a hard time recommending it to anyone because you have to because I really think it's a book you should try to read in a single sitting, even though that sitting will probably be like 4 or 5 hours. Because it does, like, it's not even like, it's deliberate, I think, on a micro level, but it doesn't have that nice tidy frame that Fitterman gives us.
Mm-hmm.
And what McCaffrey does, I'm grabbing the book so I can be correct about this, is it's in 2 parts. And the first part are kind of just all these phrases and sentences that are just linked by commas. So there's no closure to the thinking. And then the second half is just a single run-on for over 100 pages. Not quite 100 pages, but like still, that's a lot. And it's just a brick of page after page of like just a brick of text. And like it adds up, but it doesn't add up in any kind of way that gives you like a thematic closure or anything like that. It's just you start spotting patterns in the language. And there's a kind of satisfaction in that, especially if you read the whole thing in one sitting. But it really dodges meaning in a certain way, unless the meaning is just like the sensation of staring at like the chyron at the bottom of the CNN. Or I always remember like when I was a kid driving around Calgary, and there'd be the signs that would have it would just be a running text, and you would see it for like 30 seconds as you're driving by, and you'd get like 2.5 sentences worth of information. And I think McCaffrey's The Black Debt gives you the sensation of just like standing in front of this moving chyron of never-ending text.
It's weird,
which is really interesting.
Yeah, it's a weird thing to think about as a literary value, but I think it does sort of, a certain type of prose poem, like the long prose poem, it can really become an endurance test, and it can be exhausting, and it can kind of do in a way that like poetry just often isn't, and maybe doesn't want to be often, right? But if you're trying to kind of get at that feeling or that emotion, or even just put the reader through a ringer in a manner of speaking like that, it has like that opportunity to kind of really, as you say, kind of accrete and it almost even just sort of start challenging your endurance in that manner.
Let me ask you the opposite then. What do you make of prose? If we've got on one side prose poems that like will take length to the extreme, what do you make of prose poems that are kind of minimal, like the kind of short paragraph prose poem? Because the other book that I thought of right away was Harriet Mullen's Trimmings, which is a book that just kind of uses the language of like fashion to kind of think in a really light way around the relationship between like fashion and appearance and race. But all the lines, if we call them, all the sentences in it are kind of phrases or like clipped words, and they're often connected just very gently with commas. Like it's almost the opposite of McCaffrey's text. And like all the pages are kind of these like minimal paragraphs.
Yeah, I kind of like both approaches. Although what I've found myself doing personally is I'll kind of tend to see myself combining them. Like I'll do a sequence of shorter kind of paragraph poems, and but they'll kind of like drag out like that across a sequence. And then I'll try to vary the pacing of how long is this one, how short is that one, and things like this. So I like to kind of go in between, almost like take from both sides of it personally when I am working on stuff, I find. But as a reader, I really like a minimal poem in many respects. I can appreciate the kind of wall of text ones, and like some of my favorite books are like that, but they have to really work, and you have to really they have to really continually reward you, with a gem, on a really frequent basis, like almost like when you're playing a video game, it's got to give you a cool sound or a sparkle.
You got to get the coin sound.
Right? You got to get a coin sound every now and again. Whereas like a shorter, more minimalist, kind of tight prose poem, I really tend to appreciate a bit more easily. And I think because just for the simple reason that I like variety across the book.
Yeah.
So again, I like it best when I see it in sequence. I don't tend to like short prose poems that are, just standalone. I tend to like them in sequences. And I think for me, it just has to do with that, how I value narrative and narrative voice so much. And what I always am looking for or trying to produce is some sort of off-kilter narrative voice.
Yeah.
And so I just find it's something that unless you have some length, you can't really do a lot with.
Yeah.
And whereas a short snippet can work if it's stacked and accreted with other ones.
Yeah. If you got 60 pages worth of them and they kind of build in a certain way. No, I feel that.
That can work really well to me.
That's part of a shared attraction that we have, like as poets in Canada of a certain generation, to the long poem, which is a different kind of formal question. But I agree with you.
What do you think ruins a prose poem?
I was trying to think about this because we kind of took a little a little day break in between the first recording and this. Like, I was trying to think like what ruins a prose poem. I don't know, like, I think partly maybe it depends on the reader and what the reader wants. I was trying to think of like what do people regard as bad prose poetry, and I think like I always go back to that like 80s 90s moment where there were people just like imitating theory. Does that make a bad prose poem? Like just like pages and pages of abstraction and a prose brick. Like, is that something that's like, I don't know, because you said what sets apart like a good prose poem from the ones we dread. So
Yeah,
like, I'm not sure what the ones I dread are.
I kind of dread them all, but I think the reason I dread them all is because I so rarely see a prose poem I really, really, truly enjoy. Even though I love the form and I work in it more than I do otherwise, generally speaking, and I really love that form. Again, for me, it's all about that. I kind of like how it fails to be prose and fails to be a poem precisely.
Yeah.
It's kind of in that in between space. But I find that like for me, the ones I don't like or that is when they're too close to being prose or too close to being poetry. Like when they're the ones you were talking about, there was that kind of trend where every one of them was like filled with abstraction and theory speak. And to me, that was like getting too close to being an essay, right? Like I like it. I like it when it's kind of in between being an essay and being a poem and being maybe a story. I don't like when it kind of moves too close to one of those, because once it moves too close to being a story, it's not enough of, it doesn't have enough narrative drive anymore to be a really good story. So it kind of like it's like lousy flash fiction. Then if it moves too close to being an essay, like you say, it becomes too abstracted, and now there's no imagery to cling on to. There's nothing concrete there, and it actually makes, I think, the idea, it feels pretentious. Like I feel like the ideas aren't actually glomming on to a metaphor or a concrete image that will actually increase their complexity. And so it kind of starts to get into like this weird pretension space. And if it gets too close to being poetry, then I just start to feel like it's shapeless a little bit. Like it doesn't have the rigor I really want in a strong verse poem, So to me, like that in between space is really cool, where the things are overlapping in their Venn diagram or whatever. And we're getting that weird little gap where it's just kind of all they're sort of failing to be all these things and therefore kind of becoming their own thing,
Yeah. That makes sense, because I do have that feeling like once he started talking, I was like, oh yeah, the ones I actually dread are the ones that I read and I go, well, why isn't this just a novel? Why didn't you just write a novel?
It starts to feel lazy, doesn't it? Like strangely, all of a sudden, it starts to feel like, well, they didn't bother. They were too lazy to write a novel, and they thought writing a prose poem would seek fragments would be easier. I don't know if that's true ever, but it's just how it feels to me. Like, whereas
I've read a few books in the last few years that are kind of narrative long poems that feel like failed novels, and I won't mention them because that feels a bit too shots fired for me. But like, I do think like they're with narrative, and maybe with narrative and with argument, like the argument or research, there has to be, like, prose poetry is good at those things, but it also needs to do something else. And maybe defamiliarization is the thing, because you were talking about that yesterday. It needs to defamiliarize that process in a way of like writing a story or presenting some research
a little bit too. Like I think what literary language does so well is like defamiliarize the language. But I think where prose poem, I think there's a level which it also is like defamiliarizing the actual form or the genre that it's participating in a little bit too. So like when it works well, to me, it's kind of almost standoffish in that sort of way, where it's like you can't pin down what's happening at any point really well. I like that kind of thing. Like that's just now I always wonder, is it just my taste? It's just that like I think this thing is better than the other thing, and it's not really justifiable but I do think that like I'm onto something in the sense that like I've got a reason to dislike this thing or to like it. I don't know if it does boil down to taste maybe, but I just feel like when I see the trends happening, like you say, like every once in a while you'll see like a trend in poetry or a trend in the novel or whatever. And insofar as I see trends in prose poetry, I find like they tend to, it's like everybody will start doing one thing and it'll bring it closer to one form. And I just like, I'll get closer to memoir, or I'll get closer to an essay, or get closer to just a poem, and I'll get closer to flash fiction. And like, once we have those trends happening, it just starts to lose interest to me. It just gets less radical and exciting because it's not like, it's not surprising me anymore.
Yeah, like the in-betweenness is the strength of prose poetry, is kind of what you're saying, right?
Yeah, like to me anyway. I think also just there's this but if you just really just focus on the name prose poetry, I think the biggest thing I see is when it just doesn't have actual poetic qualities. Like it really is just indistinguishable from prose.
I think that probably bothers me less than it bothers you. Cause like, I don't mind it if it's like, if it makes up for it in some other way, like if it's really prosaic, but like, it's short, right? Like, so like it kind of takes advantage of the form in this other way by being fragmentary in that way. Like it's just a vignette or something. Yeah, versus because otherwise, if it's long and it's just prosaic, it's just an essay, or it's just a story, or it's just I shouldn't say it's like it's a different genre completely.
Yeah, it starts to not be a prose poem anymore.
Yeah,
I just find like when I'm flipping through a book, because you and I read a lot of poetry books.
Yeah,
and I know for me, when I'm flipping through a book and it's mostly verse poetry, and all of a sudden you turn the page and there's a prose poem there, there's just always a moment of me where it's like, I just feel like because they weren't doing that for the last 30 pages in a 70-page book, it just feels like there's no pattern that's been established of doing it. Why are you doing it now? And there can be a really good reason, and sometimes they surprise me, but I find so often it's just like, it feels like it lacks effort in terms of, like, it's a lazier construction often. Like, and because I do a lot of, like, I really am more known probably for writing poetry, but actually what I mostly do is write prose.
Yeah.
And so I think that to me, it's like, I also write prose in a way that I'd say like my interest is like a bit more stylistically motivated. Like I want to say I'm a bit of a stylist in a sense, although not like the way Anne Michaels is or something, but more in the sense of like, I can do different styles, like, and so, sometimes I'll do a real ornate Baroque kind of style, and other times I'll have a stripped down, minimalist style, but like I know how to do those two styles. And so when I see like a piece of prose poetry and it just is like, I can kind of just see where like, oh, they could have tightened that sentence, or they could have made that, they could have had some interior rhyme there if they really wanted, by just using this word. Like, it'll start to kind of feel lame to me, or rather I should say it feels a little like underdeveloped often when I find a prose poem. Maybe that's just what it is. Like I want it to kind of be in an in-between space, but I don't want it to feel undeveloped or unbaked or whatever.
So I will say, in defense of prose poetry, that the example you give of kind of this prose poem being dropped into this middle of this hypothetical book out of nowhere, I think that's less of a problem of the prose poem, and more of a problem of like, in the editorial process, it was kind of like,
that's a good point,
right? Because like the whole thing could be prose poem. Like I think a lot of times, like something that looks like a bad choice, if it's done like over time and it's repeated, it becomes a stylistic choice, right?
Sure.
So like,
you're right.
If there are extra words, or if a sentence should have been clipped or trimmed or whatever in an isolated prose poem, like if that's just part of 10 prose poems and it's a quality of the writing, then it becomes a stylistic choice. And like, and you can agree or disagree with that stylistic choice, but it shifts it.
You're probably right. I'm probably just reacting more so to like when I see isolated examples.
Yeah.
And the isolation is probably what's bothering me more than anything else, if I just get right down to it.
Yeah. Well, because I ask these questions too when I read books. It's like, oh, why suddenly is this here? Is this book a grab bag now?
Yeah. Which maybe is unfair, but that's often how I will feel. And then it probably biases me against the particular piece.
Yeah.
Before I even read it. Well, what else do you think? Is there anything, last words for prose poetry in defense of, or in support of, or in attack of prose poetry? What do you think is what haven't you seen in a prose poem that you really want to see?
What haven't I seen in a prose poem that I'd like to see?
You finish your thought, but
I was going to say I'm shocked we never mentioned Gertrude Stein once.
Should we? Now it's too late.
I'm also shocked. Like
Gertrude Stein.
I'm also shocked. Like I figured I would talk about like, oh, what's the first time you saw a prose poem? And this is why I brought up Die Brandt when we were texting, because the first time I had ever heard of a prose poem was I had to read questions I asked my mother, like in a class at UC.
Sure.
But I don't know. Like I feel like I've seen a lot of different ways the prose poem can be used, from run-on sentences to like short clipped phrases to like to polemics to narrative to it's just a form. I think there's still a lot of juice in it, but I think it's been used like in a lot of different ways.
Yeah, that's what I often find exciting about it. Like, is, as well, this is something we kind of were. I remember we were talking about and never got it. But like, one thing I really like about sequences or books of prose poetry is they start to capture a little bit of the strength and power of the novel. Bakhtin argued that the defining quality of the novel was that it was a container that could put other artworks into it, but it itself wasn't containable by other artworks. So Bakhtin's point was sort of like, you can put a poetry into the novel and it remains. You can put a poem in the novel, you can put a photograph in the novel, you can put a short piece of you can put a drawing in the novel, you can put anything in the novel and it still remains a novel. Like, it becomes kind of, it can kind of subsume different art forms into itself without losing its quality. Whereas you can't put a novel into a poem. You can't put a novel into, you could maybe argue with this, but this was Bakhtin's argument. You can't put a novel inside of a photograph. You can't put a novel inside of a, whatever. Like, so again, as you say, you can kind of maybe argue that something like that is actually happening in certain instances.
I think part of what I think let me try to anticipate where you're going when you talk about like a sequence of prose poems. I think like with the long or the sequential poem, like suddenly you can do some of that stuff. You can,
I feel
you can pull like maybe not a whole novel, but like also maybe you can.
You can, like, just all of a sudden you starts as a prose poem, then you've got a poem, lined poem inside of it, and then it concludes as a prose poem. Like, you can do things like that.
So
and you can of course do the reverse. Have a prose block in the middle of like an otherwise verse poem. I just find it's less successful for whatever reason.
Well, I think like for me the examples would be like books that absolutely straddle the line. So like in Canlit, the classic example maybe is Ondaatje's Billy the Kid. Which is like, is that a book of poetry or is it a novel? And then Dennis Cooley's kind of expansion / ripoff of Billy the Kid, Bloody Jack. Which is like 5 times longer and way more weird and absurdist. Is that a novel or a book of poetry?
It's probably where I saw a prose poem the first time too. I'm trying to think precisely because I haven't read that book for a while, but I want to say it features a prose poem or two, and that's maybe where I would have encountered them first. But I'm not sure.
Both of those are bouncing between like lined poems and prose poems. Like maybe it's in that space between the novel and the long poem, right? Where suddenly prose poetry can come in as one flavor of that. or someone like Nicole Broussard, who's writing in between those forms as well, right? Where a lot of it is kind of, we could classify it as prose poetry, but it's a fragmented novel at the same time. So like prose poetry is interesting because it kind of slides into these other genres sometimes, right? Like we could make the argument about a lot of like avant-garde fiction too, that it's if it's not prose poetry, it's prose poetry adjacent.
Or even if it's not prose poetry, what is? Right? Like it in a manner of speaking. So I think it does in some ways kind of, my like core interest is sort of in the avant-garde novel, and the long poem and the prose poem kind of gets bled into both in those respects.
Yeah.
Or the long poem sequence, whatever you want to call it. I guess I always, there's a book length long poem, and then there's a shorter long poem, which is kind of like a sequence, right?
Yeah.
But I find that that's just where I sort of gravitate towards, even if I'm doing or poem sequences. Like if I'm doing verse poem, so like I'm doing a bunch right now, and so far I haven't really written any prose poetry for this new project I'm doing. And maybe I will, maybe I won't, but it still has to me that like that sequencing of a number of things together, and as a group, and like one leading into the other, like that kind of semi-narrative build. Even if there's no narrative, I like the narrative structure of like a build or a pace, or I just find that prose poetry just lends itself so nicely to those things, where like I'm just so often interested personally, and as a writer, as a reader, in actually looking at the form of the thing, like when I do prose, when I've done some prose poetry, like in The Politics of Knives, that title poem, where I've got these like blacked out parts and stuff.
Yeah.
One of the things that is people always say to me about that particular poem, and a bunch of other things that I've done, is they'll often I'll like ape a avant-garde process, like an aleatoric process or something.
Yeah.
But I won't actually do it. I'll just appear like I'm doing it. And I'm really interested in that kind of thing for some reason, like not actually doing something, but actually pretending to do it.
Yeah.
With such a way that it like makes you think you're doing it. Like in that Politics of Knives, where like there's like blacked out, parts, like as if you had blacked out, like the CIA had blacked out parts of a document, right? That's kind of how it looks. I remember distinctly when I was going through the editing process on that book, Alana Wilcox was asking me like, hey, what words are under these blacked out parts? Because, I'll just make sure they're exactly the right length, same length as those words. And I was like, there's no words under them. It's just a bunch of blackness. I go, just make it whatever size, it'll work. What looks cool on the page. And a lot of people will assume, and then the rest of it, like people often assume is like found poetry. And sometimes it is. And sometimes, it's something I found and revised, and other times I've just constructed a thing to make it seem like a found text, and for whatever reason, I've always just found that that kind of chicanery, in a sense, interesting, and being able to kind of, I guess maybe just because I'm always thinking about like, how is the reader receiving the thing and primed to receive it, and how can I play around with the kind of gap between maybe what they're expecting and what they're going to get. And like, I just find there's all sorts of interesting little spaces and gaps. To me, like that's where all the fun is in terms of, and all the interesting effects, which is why I like jokes so much, because you got that setup and punch is so much about like setting forth an expectation and delivering on it while also not delivering what you expect.
Yeah.
And I feel like prose poetry in a weird way has that joke structure to it, as in a certain sense, like you're kind of in a book of poems and you suddenly come across something that's not really a poem, but you're being asked to receive it as one.
Yeah.
And so it kind of produces all these neat fruitions.
And the kind of mixed signals of it.
Yeah, like that's a better way to put it, probably mixed signals, like I like the mixed signal as a aesthetic sort of value in a weird way. Well, final thoughts on the prose poem, Ryan?
They're great.